Outside. Cold sweat flowed down Eddie's back like a waterfall. Gripping his shotgun tightly, he swallowed and reached out a shaking hand to peel back the blinds. The sun was slowly dissolving over the horizon, melting into an orangey haze. Faraway trees lined the distant fields, their branches spindly and bare. The sky was clear, yet a large mass of grayish clouds was quickly approaching. It was silent. Not the yelp of a fox or the passing of a breeze disturbed the air. It was always like this when they came. The air itself seemed as if it was coated in a layer of grease and slime. Eddie took sharp breaths, trying to stay as quiet as possible. Dust particles floated by his face like tiny snowflakes. A mouse scurried across the dirty floorboards, jumping through a small hole in Eddie's barricade. Eddie surveyed the room once more. The crude pile of furniture piled at the front wall was holding steady, with chairs layered atop tables and wooden planks stacked up against the doorframe. He wasn't sure how long it would keep them from getting in. Hell, maybe they were just playing the waiting game, waiting for him to go to them. Eddie opened the shotgun with a flick of his wrist. 2 shells. Not enough. 1,000 shells wouldn't be enough. He had lost the rest of them while fleeing to the room. Damned fool. A hideous smell began to soak into the air. It was the stench of rot, like the mangled, month-old corpse of a slowly decomposing animal. Soon the entire room was blanketed by the foul odor. Eddie gagged and sucked in his lips and lifted the front of his hoodie over his nose, wincing. A few minutes passed. The scent showed no signs of stopping. Eddie slowly paced back and forth from wall to wall, breathing through his teeth. It almost seemed as if the odor was changing from one pungent flavor to another, rotten eggs to vomit, spoiled milk to compost, roadkill to burnt flesh. Every unpleasantly foul smell he could ever conceive, merging into one, was filling the room. Eddie spluttered and collapsed to the ground. The dusty floorboards beneath him creaked under his weight. Choking, he scraped his hands against the walls, pulling himself upwards. Vomit was quickly rising up his throat. Retching, he bent over to throw up, but nothing would come out. Suddenly, the smell evaporated. Eddie dropped down to his knees once again and took a large gulp of air. His stubbled face was pale and cold. More time passed. Nothing changed. The room was just as dull and lifeless as before, and the land outside was still completely motionless, like a painting. Not even the sun had moved. Eddie sighed and ran his hands through his hair. How much longer would it be? Would they ever go away? Would he be here forever? Eddie awoke in a cold sweat. A vague memory of a particularly awful nightmare echoed in his head. He must have passed out. For a second, it seemed that the room and the smells were just a dream, but upon opening his eyes, he saw the harsh reality. It had all been real. So warm, so humid. It was all he could think about. Eddie's tongue felt like a slug in his mouth. A terrible aftertaste was stained in his cheeks. He glanced to the window. The glass was wet with condensation. Rainwater was pouring down outside. Eddie could barely breathe, so stuffy. Air. He needed air. Outside. He had to go out. And then he remembered. They were getting an advantage. An edge. He had to stay sharp. No more falling asleep. The shotgun lying across the floor laid in wait for Eddie's grasp. Tap, 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 tap. Tap, 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 tap. It had been going on for hours, tapping at the window, the same sequence over and over. Eddie kept his bloodshot eyes glued onto the glass. It didn't make sense. They should have gotten in by now. Were they drawing it out on purpose, relishing in his fear? Could it be that he had found their weakness, something that may finally allow him to leave? Eddie clasped his hands onto his temples. His head was throbbing. It felt like it might burst open at any moment. Too long. Far too long in the same room, doing the same thing. How long had it even been? Days? A few hours? Something had to be done. Keeping the shotgun barrel pointing firmly at the window, Eddie shuffled forwards. Then, thin slits of light poked through the gaps between the blinds. Tap, 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 tap. The shadow of a hand cast itself against the window frame. Eddie's breathing was labored. He reached out to the cord dangling next to the wall. Tap, 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 tap. Heart racing, he pulled the cord. The sunlight flooded the room as the blinds flew open. Eddie shielded his eyes, squinting at the gaps between his fingers. It was Charlie. Eddie opened the window, apprehensively, sticking the shotgun through.
"Please let me in,"
Charlie pleaded. His voice was tired and raggedy. Eddie stared in disbelief with bloodshot eyes. Several seconds passed. Charlie's eyes were glassy, and his arms hung limply by his sides. With twitchy fingers, he gave off the look of a homeless man or mental patient. His face was smooth and clean, yet oddly devoid of emotion. Just looking at it was making Eddie feel uneasy.
"Please let me in,"
Charlie repeated in a sinister way, somehow not deviating in tone or pitch from the last time he said it. This isn't," Eddie stammered. The weight of the situation was almost too much for his weakened brain to process. He found himself floundering, unable to form a coherent sentence. His train of thought was all over the place.
"Charles, you weren't.
Eddie's voice quivered as he spoke. Charlie stared blankly at Eddie's face.
"Please let me in."
Eddie gestured loosely to the red and black scarf tied around Charlie's neck. It had been lost by Charlie years ago. He was also wearing a long coat, one which Eddie recognized but couldn't quite place where from. Charlie lifted his hand and smashed it into the glass. The force with which it hit was enough to shake the entire room. Cracks were slit across the window.
You don't want..."
Eddie shouted, stepping back with the shotgun pointed squarely at Charlie's head. Charlie's dead eyes were pale and gray. He raised his fist once again. Another crack. The window wobbled on its hinges.
"Please let me in,"
Charlie repeated with the same tone and pitch as the first time it was said. Eddie closed his eyes. His hands were shaky as they slowly increased pressure on the trigger. His whole body stiffened in anticipation. Finally, the gun fired. Eddie was pushed backwards slightly at the sheer force of the blast. A deafening boom called out across the field, leaving a ringing in his ear. As the ringing died down, all that was left was Charlie's inhuman screams. Barely daring to open his eyes, Eddie creeped back over to the window. Charlie was sprawled out on the ground, writhing in agony. Broken glass was scattered across his clothes. Half of his face had been shot off, and his arm was practically hanging off its shoulder. Pellet holes had fired through the chest, and instead of blood, thick black ooze leaked from the newly opened wounds on his body. With a final shriek, Charlie's body sunk into the ground, leaving only a puddle of the inky liquid among the grass. Darkness, utter darkness, suffocating his body, its hands around his neck. He was defenseless. Eddie opened his jaw to speak, and the darkness flooded his mouth, pressing down his tongue. He couldn't tell if his eyes were open or closed. There was no floor beneath his feet, and his arms were pinned by his sides. A cold chill wisped around his shoulders.
We have been patient, Eddie. Very patient.
A disembodied voice reverbed back and forth through Eddie's ears. It was them. It had to be them.
We've given you chance after chance to surrender yourself to us, and yet you hide and cower miserably like a pathetic little worm.
It continued.
You thought we were gone, did you? We had never left, Eddie. For all those years, we were never truly gone. We were just biding our time, and now we've got you right where we want you. No more chances, Eddie. You will become like us.
A distinct whooshing noise, like the sound an aeroplane makes as it flies, could be heard in the distance, creeping closer to Eddie. The sound quickly filled the void, and Eddie struggled in the grasp of the creatures as it grew louder and louder, soaring through his ears. And just like that, he was back in the room. Eddie pushed himself off the ground, shotgun in his hands. His vision was blurry, and there were whispers all around him, whirling back and forth like a feather in a tornado. A wave of panic spread through him as he felt the presence of the monsters outside, closer than they'd ever been. He had to get out. He had to warn Charlie, the real Charlie. Eddie jumped up to the window. Small gashes opened on his arms and legs as he pushed himself through the broken glass with great effort, groaning in pain. Letting out a final grunt, his body flopped through, and he landed face first on the soil. It was freezing cold. The sun had disappeared over the horizon, and the night sky, which had been so bright with stars and constellations, was now dull and empty, save for the slightly comforting presence of the moon. Eddie clutched his sides, his teeth already chattering. They were out on the field, all around him, not visible, but there was an undeniable, looming presence even the most skeptic of all could not ignore. It was the feeling of isolation, one that stood out greatly as Eddie began to traverse the field towards the barn house. Every step he took was excruciating. Eddie darted his eyes back and forth from across the fields to the barn, praying that he might see a flash of headlights or some late-night hikers in the distance. Nobody. Charlie sat quietly at the table, newspaper in hand. There usually wasn't anything too interesting in the headlines, and today was no different. But the puzzles were always decent. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling, trying to think of another word for impatient. Twiddling his pen between his fingers, Charlie hardly noticed the sound of frantic footsteps approaching the door. Without warning, Eddie burst in, a look of death in his eyes. Charlie jumped slightly and raised his eyebrows at the bloody arms and legs of his brother. "Shit, Eddie, you okay? You've been out hunting for hours. I was going to check up on you in a minute. I heard a gunshot earlier. Did you get anything for dinner? What's with all the broken glass?" "Back! You get back! Away!" Eddie screamed. His eyes were flailing around like a madman, and he was waving the shotgun back and forth, slowly edging towards Charlie. "Ah, shit. Charlie responded. Eddie, calm down. It's me, it's Charlie. You're having another episode. Charlie, monster. What done? I'm not a monster. I ain't one of those things you used to talk about. I'm not gonna hurt you. Eddie snarled and ran for the ladder on the other side of the room, knocking over another table. Throwing the shotgun up to the second floor, he began to ascend the rungs. Save, help, Charlie. Breathing heavily, Eddie crawled up another ladder to the third floor, disappearing through a trap door that led to the roof. They were everywhere, surrounding the barn house, shapeless figures, blacker than the night. They stretched on for miles, lurking near the trees and down the road. The whispers were louder than ever. Just looking at the beings made Eddie want to tear his eyes out and squish them into the ground with his heel. The howling wind whisked over Eddie's bald head, watering his eyes and turning his hands numb. Slowly, the trapdoor opened once again as Charlie crawled out onto the roof. Leave! Get! Eddie yelled. For God's sake, Eddie, please, listen to me. Whatever you see, whatever you think is out there, isn't real. I thought we were done with this, Eddie. You haven't had an episode in more than a decade. Eddie went silent. There was a glimmer in his eyes, and for a moment it seemed the episode was over. Eddie, it's all in your head. None of it's real. You must have known it was coming, yeah? You must have known you were about to have an episode. That's why you hold down in there, to try and protect yourself from doing anything rash. Charlie gestured to the field, observing the shack with the broken window. We'll get you straight again, Eddie. We'll go to Dr. Gordon. He'll make things right. Now, just put down the The gun fired. Eddie stumbled over backwards and hit his head on the roof, dropping the gun over the edge. Charlie dropped to his knees, looking down at his exposed stomach and intestines falling out of his body, pellets lodged into his neck. Eddie, he choked out. A final wheeze came from his mouth. Charlie's eyes rolled into the back of his head, and he fell sideways off the roof, landing on the grass below with a wet thud. The first rays of sunlight cast themselves upon Eddie, stirring him from his slumber. "Oh, man," he croaked. "How wasted did we get last night, Charlie? My head's pounding like crazy. I don't even remember anything." But Charlie wasn't there. Eddie pushed himself into a standing position. He was on the roof of all places. "Charlie?" he called out. No answer. Eddie trudged over to the trapdoor, noticing a red stain on the right side of the roof. "Ah, wine. Classy," he muttered to himself. Stepping down into the living room, Charlie was nowhere to be seen. There was, however, an awful stench that seemed to be coming from outside. "Charlie, did you take the garbage out?" Eddie called out again. Still no response. A family picture was smashed on the floor near the ladder. Eddie picked it up and placed it upright on a chair, sighing. "You're cleaning this up, Charlie. Hey, listen, I'm gonna go head over to the lake for some fishing and clear my head. I might be gone the whole day. Mom and Dad are coming over about 3, so have the house ready by then. See ya." Grabbing a bucket from the kitchen and his fishing rod from his room, Eddie headed out into the chilly autumnal air, a smile on his lips.
Hello, Ed here. If you've made it this far, be sure to like and subscribe. Share this video on all your social media and show your support by becoming a patron today at patreon.com/CreepypastaED. Also, there is Ed merch available as well. Link in the description. If you have a story that you would like to be told, send it to creepypastaed@gmail.com. Until next time, remember, don't fall asleep.